Hello friends and welcome back to the Green Hack. For as long as I can remember, there was a plant that kept appearing near the fence line in my backyard. Every spring, it seemed to come back stronger than before. It would grow quietly along the edge of the garden, tucked between the wooden fence and a patch of grass that I rarely paid much attention to. To me, it was just another weed. I never stopped to ask what it was or whether it had any purpose. Whenever I saw it, I did what many gardeners do. I pulled it out and tossed it into the yard waste pile. It became part of my routine. Year after year, I removed it without a second thought. The funny thing is that the plant never seemed to give up. No matter how many times I removed it, it always found a way to return. At the time, I viewed that persistence as a nuisance. Looking back now, I realized the plant was trying to teach me a lesson that I was not ready to learn. One summer morning, I was working near the fence as usual. The tomato plants were growing well, the garden was looking healthy, and I was clearing away anything that seemed out of place. As I reached down and pulled another handful of those large leaves, I remember thinking that gardening would be easier if certain plants would simply stay gone. I tossed them aside and continued working. There was nothing special about that moment. It felt like any other day in the garden, yet sometimes the most important changes begin during the most ordinary moments. At that time, I still believed I was doing the right thing. I thought I was removing a weed that had no value. What I did not know was that a simple conversation was about to change the way I looked at that plant forever. A few minutes later, while I was still working near the fence, one of my neighbors happened to walk by. He was an experienced gardener, the kind of person who always seemed to notice things that others overlooked. We exchanged a few friendly words, and then he glanced down at the pile of plants I had just pulled from the ground. After looking at them for a moment, he asked a simple question. "Why are you throwing that away?" I remember stopping for a second because the question caught me completely off guard. To me, the answer seemed obvious. "Because it is a weed," I replied. He smiled, shook his head slightly, and said something I still remember today. Not everyone would agree with that. At the time, I did not know exactly what he meant. The plant had always looked ordinary to me. It grew along the fence, came back every year, and never seemed important enough to deserve any attention. But the confidence in his voice made me curious. This was someone whose garden always looked healthy and productive. If he saw something valuable in a plant I had spent years throwing away, maybe I was missing something. We talked for a few more minutes, and he explained that some gardeners intentionally grow that plant because of the benefits it can bring to the garden. The idea sounded strange to me. For years, I had treated it like a problem. Now someone was suggesting it might actually be useful. After he left, I could not stop thinking about that conversation. The question stayed with me for the rest of the day. Every time I looked toward the fence, I found myself wondering if I had been making the same mistake year after year. Sometimes gardening teaches us new lessons through books or experience. Other times, it starts with a single question that challenges something we have always believed. That evening, I decided to do something I had never done before. Instead of pulling the plant out of the ground, I started learning about it. The more I read, the more surprised I became. The plant was called Comfrey, and unlike the ordinary weed I had imagined for years, many gardeners considered it one of the most useful plants in the garden. What surprised me most was that some people actually went out of their way to grow it on purpose. That alone was enough to get my attention. Why would anyone intentionally plant something I had spent years removing? As I continued reading, I learned that Comfrey is known for its large leaves, vigorous growth, and deep root system. It seemed capable of returning year after year with very little attention. The plant was not valued because it produced beautiful flowers or edible vegetables. Instead, gardeners appreciated it because of the role it could play in supporting the rest of the garden. I found story after story from experienced gardeners who considered it an important part of their growing routine. Some used the leaves in compost piles, others used them around vegetables and fruit plants. The details varied, but one thing appeared consistently. People who understood the plant rarely treated it like a weed. The more I learned, the more I began questioning my own assumptions. For years, I had looked at Comfrey and seen something unwanted. I never stopped long enough to ask whether it might have a purpose. That realization reminded me of how easy it is to overlook something simply because it appears ordinary. Gardening has a way of teaching humility. Just when you think you understand your garden, it often reveals something new. Looking back, I realized I had been looking at this plant all wrong. What I thought was a problem might actually have been an opportunity sitting beside my fence the entire time. After spending a few days learning about Comfrey, I decided it was time to stop reading and start experimenting. I did not expect miracles, and I was not trying to transform my garden overnight. I was simply curious enough to see whether this plant deserved a place in my gardening routine. So instead of pulling it out, I harvested a few of the large leaves and began using them in simple ways around the garden. The first thing I tried was adding the leaves to my compost pile. That felt like an easy place to start. The leaves were large, easy to collect, and seemed to break down surprisingly well over time. A little later, I experimented with using some of the chopped leaves as mulch around a few of my tomato plants. I also became curious about another method I had seen mentioned by experienced gardeners. Some people soaked comfrey leaves in water and used the resulting liquid as a garden feed. The process sounded simple enough, so I decided to give it a try as well. What I liked most was that none of these methods required expensive equipment or complicated instructions. They fit naturally into the gardening habits I already had. I was not changing my entire approach. I was simply finding ways to make use of something that had been growing beside my fence for years. Over time, Comfrey became another small tool in my gardening toolbox. It was no longer a plant I rushed to remove. Instead, it became something I paid attention to and used when it made sense. The surprising part was not that Comfrey suddenly solved every problem in the garden. The surprising part was realizing how many years I had spent throwing away something useful without ever giving it a second thought. That realization stayed with me every time I walked past the fence. By the end of the season, I found myself thinking less about Comfrey and more about the lesson it had taught me. The truth is, this story was never really about a single plant growing beside a fence. It was about how easy it is to overlook something simply because we see it every day. For years, I looked at Comfrey and saw a problem. I never stopped long enough to ask whether it might have value. That experience reminded me that gardening is often less about finding new things and more about paying closer attention to what is already there. Every garden has plants, habits, and opportunities that we barely notice. Sometimes the most useful things are not the ones we buy from a store or read about in a gardening magazine. Sometimes they are already growing quietly in a corner of the yard, waiting for us to see them differently. That is exactly what happened to me. A plant I had spent years removing became something I appreciated and used as part of my gardening routine. I think the same idea applies beyond the garden. In life, we often search far away for answers while overlooking what is right in front of us. Slowing down, staying curious, and being willing to question our assumptions can lead to discoveries we never expected. That simple question from a neighbor changed the way I looked at a plant, but it also changed the way I pay attention to my garden. Today, whenever I walk past the fence, I no longer see a weed. I see a reminder that value sometimes hides in plain sight. Thank you for spending part of your day with me here at The Green Hack. Have you ever discovered a plant that surprised you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy simple gardening lessons and backyard wisdom, please subscribe and join us for more stories from the garden. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep looking a little closer at the things you might normally overlook.